Hello, welcome to the big brownie showdown that we've all been waiting for. We're going to get started straight away with Jane's patisserie recipe. If you are on Instagram, if you know anything about the really popular baking websites on the internet, this will be where you will have been dragged to at some point. Jane's recipes are really good, and I'm excited to try this one. So, pretty standard brownie ingredients: butter, chocolate, sugar, cocoa powder, eggs, nothing too out there. I was a little bit frustrated. I thought that I'd got pure dark chocolate and M&S did me dirty with the dark milk chocolate, which, never mind, but you should be looking for about 70% chocolate, and I've got 54% here. So this is pretty standard process for brownies. Jane likes you to break up the chocolate and the butter and melt those together. You can do this two ways. You can either do it on the hob or you can do it in the microwave. I always do it in the microwave because I just have never got an appropriate bowl to do that on the hob. You should really get like a glass one or something, that is not going to shatter basically on the hob. So I always do it in this bowl, which I actually think is a Nigella bowl that was passed down to us. And I always just do that in the microwave. This always seems like a horrific amount of butter, but bear with, it is so worth it. And I think compared to a lot of standard cakes and baking, you do need that high fat for that really like fudgy caramelly feeling in a brownie. So I always just trust whatever it says in a brownie recipe, whatever we say. But let's see how the other brownie recipes do with the butter content as well, because I'm not entirely sure how that compares. So we're also going to do something quite unique here. So Jane's brownie recipes, and I actually think a few of her other recipes as well, get you to beat the caster sugar and the eggs together with the whisk attachment. If you don't have a freestanding mixer, you can do this with a hand whisk. Actually gets you to do that for ages, so that basically it's a completely different colour. So I will show you what this looks like. It's also quite a lot of eggs. I think it's 4 eggs. I'm going to find out. And I remember when I initially did one of her recipes, I thought that it seemed so excessive, but it really does give such a great texture to her bakes. And I think that's probably one of those things where you kind of just have to trust the process. Okay, so I'm going to combine the eggs and the sugar here, and the whole purpose is basically to just get as much air as possible. So Jane's patisserie recipes for brownies do not contain any raising agent in there, so the only air, the only raising sort of process is going to be coming from this here. So you can see how it's a really bright, vibrant yellow from the egg yolks here. We're going to completely change that, and it's going to be a nice pale, almost like creamy yellow in a second, which I'll show you as well. But all the air for the brownies are going to come from this process. So it's really important that we don't skimp or kind of skip or quicken up that process here. Here's all the dry ingredients. So it's literally just flour and cocoa powder. All these recipes, and I know that so many chefs are kind of on this, but all these recipes are like, use a good quality cocoa powder. I literally just use the one that is available, and like the most accessible in supermarkets, whether it's green and blacks, or there's one in a green packet that I sometimes get as well. And that's the one that I use. Don't use like hot chocolate powder. Don't get sucked into that trap. It's not the same. And Jane's patisserie recipe calls for a lot of chocolate chunks. So I think it's about 300 grams, and because it's triple chocolate, it's dark milk and white chocolate. So if you're a chocolate fan, this is the one to go for, because it's really dense and densely packed with those chocolate chunks as well. Okay, so you can see how the egg and the sugar is like not recognizable as egg and sugar here. It's a completely different color. It's so, so important. We're going to combine the melted chocolate and butter, which has been left to cool for about 5 minutes as per the recipe. With that egg and sugar, you do not want to cook the egg. You don't want scrambled egg in your brownie. So we're going to combine those by folding that in. Again, you don't want to lose the air that you've just beaten in. I actually find this the most satisfying part of baking brownies. I absolutely love folding, but I will speed this up because it's quite boring to watch, really. But it's just such a gorgeous colour. You really want that pale white, pale yellow, like lemon colour, to be melding in really, really well with the chocolate and butter. Okay, so we're gonna sieve in the dry ingredients. I'll be honest, I'm quite a lazy baker, so if I was just doing this like on a normal day, I probably wouldn't sieve them in. I'd probably just chuck it all in. But because I'm doing this for the video, I will endeavour to make sure I do it according to the recipe. And also, I suppose because we're not really adding in any raising agents and because we need to get as much air as possible, I suppose this is actually kind of important. So I will trust Jane on this. This always really annoys me when you're sieving cocoa powder because there's always those little lumps. If that's the case, just kind of press them through with a spoon, then discard any other bits that you end up with. And then it's just a case of, again, folding. Don't want to lose any of that air that you've built up. So fold it in with the wet ingredients, and you will be left with the silkiest, most lovely brownie mix. It's actually very similar to the ones that you can... This sounds so... I'm going to sound like such a Philistine here, but it really reminds me of like those really indulgent box mixes that you can get from America, like the Ghirardelli ones, because it's just so thick and chocolatey. But you can have pride in the fact that you've made it all yourself. And then the last stage is adding in those chocolate chunks, which makes it like a really, really thick mix. I've actually mixed that so badly looking back at this, but just make sure that you don't want to beat out that air. So there's always a bit of trepidation when you're doing this section. So yeah, just mix that until it's just combined, so that it's ready to go in the tin. Okay, and then we're ready to decant into probably just like a standard brownie tin is what Jane recommends. She actually does provide some sizing there. I just have this brownie tin that I always use, and it's always been the correct size for her recipes, so it's always what I've used. Just make sure it's lined. You don't want it sticking to the side, and you just want it as easy to cool afterwards. But yeah, I just make sure that I can scrape the sides of the bowl and make sure that every little morsel of chocolatey goodness is out there. And then once we've made sure that every single last bit is in there, we'll just put that into an oven for 20 to 25 minutes. I would always check at that lower end of the scale because I want it kind of gooey and fudgy. If you prefer a cakey brownie, make sure you do the full time. So let's get that in the oven at 170 degrees. It's a slightly cooler oven. 20 minutes, and this is the result. So keep it in the tin to cool for a little longer. 5 minutes later, put it on a wire rack to cool. The next one that we're going to try is the chocolate brownie cake from BBC Good Food. This has been an absolute staple in my family's repertoire of standard recipes. I know this recipe works. I know that this recipe slaps every single time. So I don't really have to try particularly hard in remembering what I need to do with each step. It's also so easy to do. This sells itself as a chocolate brownie cake, so more of like a dessert. I actually have sort of experimented with putting this in a tray, so like a tray bake as well, and it works exactly fine. I would recommend, if you're going to do that, double the recipe, put it in a tray bake like we did with Jane's, and it will work absolutely fine. But for this trial, I'm going to do it in a cake tin and do it exactly how the recipe says. What I like about this recipe in particular is that you put most of the ingredients in a pan to melt together at the beginning and then add the dry ingredients at the end. So there's very little steps. This took me, I think, about 12 minutes to do in total before I ended up putting it in the oven. So it's amazingly quick to put together. I've definitely done like an emergency brownie when I just felt like I needed like a really quick dessert and I knew that I had all the ingredients in. But essentially what we're doing here is we're putting the butter, sugar, chocolate and syrup. There's golden syrup here as well, and I basically will show you what that syrup does at the end. But the syrup and the brown sugar in particular just give this brownie just the most delicious crust on the top, which, I don't know, it just gives it a special something. It cannot be stressed enough how much time and labour this recipe does not take. This is the most labour intensive part of the whole recipe, making sure that the chocolate and the butter and the sugar is in at the right amount and is all chunked up and ready to go. Once we've put all this in the pan, that's also another thing as well, because you're obviously putting chocolate over direct heat, just make sure that you're using a heavy bottom good quality pan. But once we've done that, it's literally just put it on the stovetop. I'm going to measure out the dry ingredients as well, so just flour, some raising agents, so baking powder, and the cocoa powder. And that's just so that I'm ready to go with that once everything's ready and off the hob. Here I'm just showing you what the ingredients look like when they're being heated up. It's a really simple process. The main aim is to just make sure that those ingredients keep moving around periodically. The butter will melt everything else pretty much, and the syrup and the sugars will melt down too. Just make sure that chocolate doesn't burn. You want this to be on like the lowest heat, so I've got this on the smallest ring on the lowest heat, and I'm just making sure that nothing's burning and it's keeping relatively cool. I take it off the heat and I keep it off the heat for at least 5 minutes before I whisk these eggs in. Again, we do not want bits of scrambled eggs in our brownie. It's just not the vibe. It's not what people come here for. And we whisk this before putting it in a bit at a time into this mixture. You can see that chocolate mixture is kind of a strange texture. It's very like grainy, and it's just because of all those sugars that are in there. The egg will kind of bind that together and make it a lot more workable, and you'll really start to see that come together now. So you can see that texture has completely changed. It's gone kind of shiny and silky, and it's pulling away from the edges of the pan. We're going to add our dry ingredients. Again, I've sifted them here. I probably wouldn't do that on a normal day, but we're just going to try it just to be fair for this trial. It looks like not that many dry ingredients compared to Jane's patisserie recipe. I think it's just because there's much more of those wet ingredients. And these just, again, it's not really a folding process, it's more of just making sure they're all just mixed before we put those into the pan for baking. Once put those into the pan, again, just make sure that the cake tin is lined, And we're going to go into the oven for about 20 minutes, but again, just make sure that there's like a little bit of a jiggle in the middle. And I think this one's particularly important for that one as well, because I tend to use this recipe as more of a dessert than like a, like a brownie that I would have in the afternoon or as like a little sweet treat. So I do really want that like fudgy, gooey texture in the middle. Trust your instincts on this one. And then when they come out of the oven, I've got the cake, which is nice and springy, a little bit fudgy in the middle, not really pulling away at the sides. And then the Jane's Patisserie recipe has been cooling a bit on the wire rack as well, and that's looking great. So very stable. So we'll come back and cut these up towards the end. The next recipe that I want to try is Nigella's recipe from At My Table. Nigella has quite a few brownie recipes. I think she's got like a few recipes for roast chicken, a few recipes for pancakes, a few recipes for brownies, and we're going to try her emergency brownie recipe, which traditionally she uses foil containers, like a foil takeaway containers. Um, I have not got any of those, and I didn't particularly want to throw away a container, so I've just lined a loaf tin, which would have been the same size for this recipe. The idea behind these brownies is that you could basically make a portion of 2 brownies for 2 people in an emergency, or even, I suppose, if you're particularly hungry, you could make brownies for 1 person with the ingredients that any baker would have in the cupboard. I really like this recipe, less so for the actual recipe itself and more for the fact that in the series that they had for this recipe book, so At My Table on the BBC, there is a scene where she makes these brownies and she like sneaks down to the kitchen to make them in her dressing gown. She's got like a silk kimono and she like sneaks down, makes them at like 10 o'clock at night, or I suppose like midnight because it's Nigella. And she's like trying to prove to you how easy this is to like just knock up in a few minutes. To be fair to her, this recipe is super easy because it's basically like 50 grams of butter. I think it's like 70 grams of sugar or something. So it doesn't really take that much for all the ingredients to combine. And as with the last recipe, again, it's about melting those ingredients on the hob. There is no breaking up of dark chocolate in this recipe. It's about once you've combined the butter and the sugar, you then mix in the dry ingredients, so the cocoa powder and the flour, and that then creates that batter. And then if you choose, you can then put in chocolate chunks, nuts, anything like that. So I chose to put in chunks of dairy milk because that's what I was feeling at the time. But I suppose what I would say is if you're really feeling like a really, really chocolatey brownie, I don't think this is particularly the one that you want to go for because it's not going to have that like really fudgy, chocolatey, caramelly texture because it just doesn't have that dark chocolate in there. The cocoa powder does do the job, but it just doesn't carry it as much as a dark chocolate recipe would do. Again, I think when you're adding the egg here, just make sure it's completely cool, and again, it completely changes the texture here and makes it what you would expect of a brownie dough. Once you've done that, just add in those chocolate chunks. Don't be too fussy about how chunky they are. Mine were particularly chunky. I mean, I've literally got like whole squares of dairy milk in there, but I wasn't particularly bothered. I like my chocolate quite chunky in brownies, so I was not too fussy about that. I did recognise though that because I'd obviously done everything in the same pan, the chocolate started melting so really quickly, so I basically had to rush to get them all into that container. Put them in the container, and then I think it's again around 15 to 20 minutes in the oven once you've got everything combined. So it was pretty easy to get all these brownies done, get them in the oven, cool them. What I did was I wanted to do like a little blind taste test with my boyfriend, so I have made sure that I cooled them all sufficiently and cut them up and basically put them on plates for him to taste test, which you'll be able to see now. Okay, so brownies are out, they're done. This one is Jane's Patisserie. This one is BBC Good Food. I don't think this really counts as a fair test because this one doesn't really have what the others have. And this one is Nigella's Emergency Brownie. I'm going to get Henry to taste test and tell me which one his favourite one is. I have a feeling that I know which one is going to be his favourite one because he's liked it when I've made it in the past. But we'll see. Do you want to come in? No, you're not allowed to know. That's the point. You're not allowed to know, that's the point.
I have to eat the whole thing?
No, just a taste.
Oh, right.
Yeah. What do you think of that one?
That's nice.
Any more specifics?
That's pure chocolate, that is.
Yeah.
Just chocolate, straight on chocolate.
Chocolate,
yeah.
Isn't it?
Got a lovely moistness to it.
Mm.
Oh.
Oh, you like that one?
It's got like a bit of a crust on the top.
Yeah.
Again, I'm getting chocolate and chocolate.
Okay, what about this last one?
Interesting. Different vibe, a bit cakier. Subtle chocolate.
Yeah, it's not as strong as the others, is it? So which one's the winner?
Look, I think if I had to choose a winner for dessert, would be this one.
Yeah.
This one would be great with a coffee.
Oh yeah.
And then this one's with lunch.
Okay. I thought you were going to choose this one, hands down. Because that's got like the most chocolate in it.
I know, but there's something about that crust.
Yeah, my mum's favourite is that one.
She's got good taste in it,
Yeah,
hasn't
she used to get me to make that all the time.
Well, you should make them all then.
I've never made that one for you before.
It's nice.
Well, you can have a full slice of that if you want.
Perhaps like a thing.
So I think the winner there was clear that it was the BBC Good Food one, which I was genuinely really surprised by. But thank you so much for watching this, guys. Please leave a comment on things that you'd like to see me review in the future, and don't forget to like and subscribe.